cold water folds around a white feather at the edge of a still lake, and you can almost hear the quiet arrogance of it, as if one color, repeated long enough, could become a law. You, beloved seeker, were not brought here to worship what is merely familiar. You were brought here because your spirit can feel when an old certainty has started pretending to be truth. For centuries in Europe, the black swan was treated like nonsense, an impossibility. Every swan anyone important claimed to have seen was white, so the pattern hardened. It moved from observation into language, from language into thought, and from thought into something heavier, assumption dressed up as reality. That is how the invisible system always works. It does not need chains when repetition will do the job. It does not need force when habit can train the eye to stop looking. And maybe that is why this subject matters to you more than it first appears. Because the bird is not only a bird, it is a test. It is what happens when one living fact stands against a whole structure of expectation. You already know this pattern, even if you have never said it out loud. People see the same thing over and over, and then they begin to believe they have seen everything. They call that confidence. They call that reason. Sometimes they even call that wisdom. But often, it is only the comfort of an unchallenged model. Then, history gave that model a wound it could not close. In the late 17th century, the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlamingh reached Western Australia and saw what Europe had declared could not exist. A black swan, alive on the water, no rumor, no symbol, no clever story, moving through the world with no concern at all for the belief it had just destroyed. And that is the part I need you to hold on to. The creature did not argue. It did not defend itself. It simply existed. And by existing, it became one fact against the system. If that opening insight lands with you, subscribe and leave a like, because what that sighting really broke was far bigger than a sentence about birds. And that is where the deeper investigation begins. Because the real force of that sighting was not in the feathers or the water or even the shock of the men who saw it. It was in what the bird did to a sentence people trusted. All swans are white had sounded complete, polished, settled. Then one dark body on open water touched that claim, and the whole structure split. You need to notice how merciless truth can be when it arrives in living form. 1,000 white birds could never prove the rule forever, but one black swan could end it in an instant. That is the pattern the invisible system never wants you to study too closely. It trains you to believe that repeated confirmation equals permanent certainty. It tells you that if something has been seen enough times, taught enough times, and repeated enough times, then it has earned the right to become law. But the bird says otherwise. The bird says universals are fragile. The bird says a single contradiction can outweigh a mountain of comfort. And if you are listening carefully, you can already feel why this matters beyond natural history. Because some of the claims hanging over your own life only look powerful until the right fact touches them. You have seen this, even if you did not call it by name. A room can be full of people repeating the same idea and still be one honest observation away from collapse. That is why they called you impossible before they called you real. Not because truth was absent, but because the model had no room for it yet. The old belief about swans was not evil, but it was complete in the most dangerous way. Complete enough to stop searching. And any system that stops searching starts worshiping its own reflection. So the black swan becomes more than a rare creature. It becomes a warning about certainty itself. Some drift in quietly, wearing the clean face of common sense. Some sit for generations in polished language, never challenged, because nobody has crossed the right stretch of water yet. Then, suddenly, the anomaly that breaks the model appears, and everyone who trusted the old map has to decide whether they love truth more than they love being right. And that decision, the moment the first contradiction appears, is where everything begins to separate. And once that separation begins, you start seeing the bird in a second way, not only as a creature on distant water, but as a pattern of disruption that keeps appearing whenever certainty grows too proud. What once named an impossible animal slowly became a way of naming an event, something outside normal expectation, something heavy with consequence, something people rush to explain only after it has already changed the room. That shift matters because the old saying did not stay in the past with maps and voyages. It moved into the architecture of thought. A black swan event is rare. Rarity alone is too weak. A cold morning is rare in one season, common in another. A strange cloud can draw your eye and mean nothing. But this kind of arrival does more. It enters from beyond the forecast, strikes with unusual force, and then leaves people scrambling through old notes, old models, old language, trying to prove they should have seen it coming. You have watched that happen. The air changes, the floor under the story shifts, and suddenly, everyone starts speaking in a new tone. As if hindsight were wisdom, as if neat explanations could erase the shock that was on their face a moment before. And this is where the invisible system becomes even more revealing. It builds expectations before the event. It also cleans up the event afterward. It edits memory. It smooths rough edges. It whispers that the disruption was obvious, manageable, almost predictable. Why? Because uncertainty threatens the illusion of control. If the bird can appear where your map said it could not, then your map is no longer sacred. And if your map is not sacred, then neither is the voice that told you to trust it without question. You, of all people, need to hear that slowly. Some of the most life-changing moments do not announce themselves with perfect logic first. They arrive awkwardly, sharply, with wet wings and a silence that unsettles every tidy theory around them. Then later, after the impact, people line up their words and pretend the pattern was always there. But it was not. That is why they called you impossible in certain seasons. Because your presence, your clarity, your timing did not fit the forecast they had already approved. And once you understand how the bird gets explained after the fact, you begin to see the next danger. Not the event itself, but the story people tell so they never have to be changed by it. And that story people tell afterward is exactly why this bird does not belong only to history. It belongs to the private chambers of your own mind. Because long before a dark shape appears on water, most people are already carrying a white swan map inside themselves. They have a forecast for what they are allowed to become, what kind of path makes sense, what kind of calling fits the approved pattern. The old belief about the bird becomes an inner operating system, quiet, efficient, limiting. You can feel how it works. If the mind has only seen one kind of outcome, it starts treating that outcome like destiny. If the inner model has only known one kind of approval, one kind of safety, one kind of belonging, it begins filtering everything else out. Not because the new form is false, but because it is unfamiliar. That is the technical side of the mystery. The soul may be reaching towards something larger, while the internal model keeps rejecting the signal as noise. And that is why so many people stay loyal to patterns that no longer fit them. They are not only afraid of being wrong, they are afraid of becoming visible in a form they have never rehearsed. The bird exposes that fear with almost painful simplicity. It does not ask permission from the old sentence. It does not wait for the map to update. It moves through the same water in a different color, and by doing so, it rewrites every assumption that depended on sameness. You need to hear that personally. Some of the most powerful disruptions in your life will not come as disasters. They will come as recognitions. A truth about your own direction, a calling that feels strange at first touch, a form of clarity that makes your previous limits look inherited rather than real. And when that happens, the invisible system inside you will try to do what every old system does: reduce the signal, dismiss the evidence, keep the model intact. That is the hidden pressure. Not whether the bird exists, but whether you will let its existence alter your self-concept. Because once you admit that a living exception can share the same water as the old pattern, you can no longer pretend your current identity is the full inventory of who you are. And the moment that realization lands, a more difficult question rises. What if some of the limits you still defend were never truths at all, only unchallenged sightings? And those unchallenged sightings are exactly what give the old model its emotional power. The bird does not only confront logic, it confronts attachment. Because once a culture, a mind, or a soul has lived beside white feathers for long enough, the familiar begins to feel righteous. It begins to feel safe. That is why the dark bird is so unsettling. Not because it is violent, not because it is loud, but because it carries a quiet contradiction on its body. And that contradiction asks a hard question. Do you want what is true, or only what has felt stable? You have to be honest about that tension. Most people say they welcome truth, but the creature on the water reveals something deeper. They welcome truth when it agrees with the pattern already stored inside them. They welcome truth when it does not cost them a sentence they have repeated for years. But when the living exception arrives, glossy and undeniable, with wet feathers catching light where no one expected them to be dark, something in the old structure tightens. The invisible system begins defensive work. It minimizes, it delays. It says, maybe this changes less than it seems. It would rather shrink the sighting than surrender the certainty. That is why the black swan matters to your own journey of self-mastery. When a new form of truth appears in your life, the first resistance is often internal loyalty to the pattern that raised you. You may sense a wider calling, a truer shape, a cleaner alignment, and still feel the pull to return to what was approved before. The bird exposes that split with painful accuracy. It glides through the same water as every old belief, yet it does not blend in. And because it does not blend in, it forces a choice. You either let the sighting alter the model, or you protect the model from the sighting. This is where many people hesitate, not because the evidence is weak, but because belonging to the old sentence feels warmer than standing with the new fact. They called you impossible in moments like that, not because you were unreal, but because your form demanded a revision they were not ready to make. And once you see how much emotion is hiding inside certainty, you start to understand why some people can look straight at the bird and still refuse to see it. And that is where the story stops being about one bird on open water and starts being about the way your own mind keeps records. The black swan does not just challenge a sentence from the past. It exposes the hidden forecast running underneath your days. What you expect, what you notice, what you dismiss before it ever reaches your heart. That is the real system under review. You can think of the mind like a shoreline after wind passes through reeds. Some things leave a clear line. Some things barely move the surface. But the bird is the kind of sight that forces the whole shoreline to register again. It is the sight that breaks the model, because the model was built to protect familiarity, not truth. And once familiarity is threatened, the system inside you starts doing what it always does. It trims the strange thing down. It says, that was a rare case. It says, that does not change the rule. It says anything, really, to keep the old pattern standing. But you are not being asked to worship the old pattern. You are being asked to notice where it lives. This matters so much on a personal level. The black swan does not only arrive as a fact outside expectation, it arrives as a test of allegiance. Do you belong to the clean, safe story you already know? Or do you belong to truth, when truth rewrites every assumption? That question can feel small at first, but it is never small. Because the moment you defend a false limit long enough, it starts wearing your own voice. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like caution. It sounds like maturity. And sometimes it is only fear with good posture. So when the bird appears again in your mind, in memory, in conviction, in that quiet place where you decide what is possible, do not rush past it. Let it stand there. Let it make the room uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a failure. It is information. It means something deeper than habit is trying to speak. And if you listen closely, you may realize the next sighting is already happening somewhere you were not taught to look. That is why the bird keeps mattering after the first sighting has faded from the page. It does not just expose a false claim about feathers and color. It exposes how quickly people protect the story that makes them feel settled. The black swan stands there like a quiet correction. No shouting, no warning, just a dark body moving through the same water that once made everyone feel certain. And that is the part most minds resist. They do not only fear being wrong, they fear what being wrong will require. If the bird is real, then the old frame is not enough. If the exception is real, then the whole habit of dismissing difference starts to look dangerous. That is why the anomaly that breaks the model feels so threatening. It is not because the creature is strange. It is because it proves the old pattern was never complete. You can hear that struggle in the language people use when they meet a fact they did not expect. They soften it, they delay it, they wrap it in polite words so they can keep the old map in place a little longer. But the water does not care about that. The light hits the feathers. The current moves under it. The bird remains what it is. And in that moment, one fact against the system is enough to make the system look fragile, just exposed. This is where your own life starts to echo the same lesson. The thing you have been told to ignore may be the very thing pointing to your real direction. The part of you that does not fit the easy chart may not be a mistake at all. It may be the first honest sign that your life is larger than the model assigned to it. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Because every time you try to shrink the sighting back into comfort, something inside you knows it is lying. So the black swan becomes a mirror as much as a bird. It asks whether you will defend the old certainty or let the new fact touch your inner world and change the shape of what you call possible. And just when that question settles in, another one rises behind it. What else have you been calling impossible, only because no one trained you to look there? And that question is where the investigation turns inward with even more force. Because once the bird has exposed the weakness of old certainty, it also begins testing the structure of the one who sees it. Not every mind responds to the same sight in the same way. Some adjust, some argue, some quietly file the contradiction away and keep living as if nothing happened. The creature reveals more than error. It reveals loyalty. So the black swan functions like a measure. It shows whether a system exists to serve truth or whether truth is only welcome when it does not disturb the system. You can watch this happen in something as simple as a sentence. At first, the old claim sounds complete. Then, the dark bird enters the frame, and suddenly, the claim has to choose. Will it open and become wiser, or will it tighten and protect itself? That same process happens in people. It happens in you. The moment an unforeseen fact brushes against your beliefs, your inner architecture starts making decisions before you are even fully aware of them. You feel it in the body, too. A little tightening in the chest, a pause, the dry taste of resistance. That small inward friction is not random. It is the sound of an old model defending its territory. The bird does not force that reaction into you. It reveals it. And so, self-mastery matters so much here. If you cannot stay present when the unexpected arrives, you will misread the whole moment. You will call truth a threat simply because it made you uncomfortable. You will call the new form disorder simply because it did not ask permission from what came before. But the bird moves through the water without apology. That is the lesson. Reality does not bend itself to preserve your previous interpretation. If your framework is honest, it will revise. If it is proud, it will rationalize. And the difference between those two responses is enormous. One leads to awakening, the other leads to a polished kind of blindness that can speak very confidently while seeing very little. So now the question is no longer just, did the old claim fail? It is sharper than that. When the unforeseen enters your life, what in you reaches for truth? And what in you reaches for control? Because the answer to that determines whether the next sighting becomes wisdom or just another ignored disturbance on the surface. And that ignored disturbance is often where the deepest reversal begins. Because the bird does not merely sit inside the observer's field of vision. It changes the meaning of the observer. The old belief was supposed to classify the creature. Instead, the creature ended up classifying the belief. That is a profound shift, and feel its weight. The dark shape on the water did not arrive as a debate. It arrived as evidence. And once evidence arrives, the one doing the looking is not above the scene. They are inside it. So this sign is so unsettling to proud systems. The watcher expects to expose the unknown. But sometimes the unknown exposes the watcher first. The men who saw that bird did not only discover a new form, their sighting revealed the limits of the frame they carried with them. The lake did not change for them. The feathers did not negotiate. What changed was the credibility of the observer's certainty. In one moment, the question moved from, "What is that?" to something far more difficult. What in us was unable to imagine it? You have lived that reversal in quieter ways. There are seasons when people look at a fact, a calling, a person, even a pattern in their own life, and assume the strange thing is the problem. But sometimes the real problem is the lens. Sometimes the unfamiliar needs no correction. Sometimes it is one fact against the system, showing the system where it has been blind. And that can be hard to accept because it means the disturbance is not always a threat to truth. Sometimes it is the doorway to it. Notice how clean that is. The bird does not explain itself. It simply keeps existing in full view, while the observer must choose, expand or harden. That is the split. A humble mind revises. A defensive mind relabels. A clear spirit receives the correction. A threatened spirit starts building excuses. And the difference between those responses becomes the difference between awakening and stagnation. So now the investigation is no longer about the water alone, or the sighting alone, or even the sentence that failed. It is about the one who sees and the framework they trust. Because once the bird has turned the lens back on the observer, another question begins to move under the surface. What if the strangest thing in the scene was never the creature, but the certainty looking at it? Once you admit that the lens can be wrong, the bird takes on another kind of power. It is no longer only a rare shape on water. It becomes a check against every easy assumption the mind tries to protect. The feathers look simple from far away, dark against the bright surface. But up close, the scene is never simple. Light slides off the body. Ripples fold and break. The whole image keeps changing as soon as you think you've pinned it down. That is why the black swan is the anomaly that breaks the model. The model expects the world to stay obedient to what has already been seen. The bird refuses that. It doesn't argue, it doesn't perform, it doesn't ask to be understood first. It just exists in plain sight. And that alone rewrites every assumption built on repetition. The mind wants the safe answer. The bird offers the true one. And you can feel how personal that becomes. Because people do the same thing with truth when truth arrives wearing unfamiliar clothes. They look for a familiar pattern to soften it. They ask whether it fits, whether it belongs, whether it can be explained away without changing too much. But the dark bird does not give them that comfort. It stays different. It stays there. And if you are honest, you know why that unsettles systems so badly. Because systems depend on subjects staying readable, predictable, and small enough to file away. You are not meant to stay small inside a broken forecast. That is the deeper message moving under this whole story. The creature on the lake is teaching you what the old sentence could not. What matters is not whether the world has one approved form. What matters is whether you have the courage to let one real sighting correct years of inherited certainty. That is where wisdom starts, not in defending the map, but in noticing when the map has become a lie. And the strange part is this. Once the bird has corrected the viewer, it may not be the last thing in the water that was waiting to be seen. And that is the part the old system hates most. Not the sighting itself, but what happens after people start talking about it. The black swan has already done its work by then. The feathers are gone from the water, the moment is over, and still the mind keeps circling back. That is where the real battle starts. Because the first defense of a broken model is reinterpretation. You can almost hear it happen. A rare case, a one-off, a strange event that does not really alter the larger picture. That kind of language sounds calm, but it is doing something very specific. It is trying to keep the old frame from collapsing under the weight of one fact against the system. The bird does not need to argue. The retelling does the arguing for it. Every soft label, every polished explanation, every neat summary is a hand reaching out to put the lid back on the box before too much light gets in. And if you are paying attention, you start to notice the same move in your own life. They called you impossible when your shape did not match the chart they trusted. Not because you were chaotic, but because you were readable in a way they had not prepared for. That is what unsettles shallow models. They are fine with novelty as long as it stays decorative. But when novelty rewrites every assumption, the whole room gets nervous. The facts are still there. The mind just does not want to live under them. So the question becomes simple, even if it does not feel simple at first. Will you let the story around the bird shrink the bird itself? Or will you stay with the evidence long enough to let it change your language, your expectations, your sense of what can exist? That is the pressure point, the meaning, the courage to stop defending the sentence that failed. Because once you stop protecting the old sentence, something else begins to move under the surface. And it is not finished yet. And that is why the next layer matters. Because the danger is no longer the sighting itself, but the tidy story built around it afterward. The bird has already entered the record. Now the real work begins in the way people explain it, smooth it over, and hand it back to the mind as something harmless. That is the quiet trick of false clarity. It makes disruption sound finished before it has even been understood. You can see how easily that happens with the black swan. A real contradiction appears, and then the mind reaches for a polished sentence to cover the ache. It says the event was rare but manageable. It says the old model was almost right. It says enough to keep the discomfort from changing anything deep. But notice what is happening there. Explanation can become a kind of sedation. It can numb the very force that was meant to wake you up. That is why the bird stands in the background of this whole story. It is the interruption that refuses to stay decorative. One fact against the system was never supposed to feel this heavy. Yet it does, because every time a false frame gets defended, the weight shifts back onto the listener. Will you protect the comfort of the old story or let the truth leave a mark? That is the real question, not whether the world can surprise you. It already has. The question is whether you will let surprise correct you. And once you start seeing that, you understand why so many people stay stuck. They do not lack evidence. They lack the willingness to let evidence do its full work. They would rather live with a clean explanation than with an honest wound in the model. But the black swan does not care about clean explanations. It keeps on being what it is, and that stubborn reality is what makes it so powerful. It does not ask permission to change your assumptions. So now the tension is building in a new place, not around the fact itself, but around what the fact is asking of you if you stop looking away. And what that truth is asking of you has everything to do with whether you can endure the collapse of a trusted pattern without collapsing with it. The bird is not only an interruption, it is a revealer. It glides across the same water, under the same sky, and suddenly what used to feel solid starts sounding thin. That is not destruction for its own sake. That is exposure. It is the moment a false certainty loses its sacred tone. You should understand how merciful that can be, even when it feels sharp. For generations, white feathers carried more authority than they deserved. Then this darker form appeared, and all at once, the old claim had to loosen its grip. The creature did not wound truth. It wounded illusion. There is a difference. Illusion feels warm because it is familiar. Truth can feel cold at first because it asks you to release something you once trusted. But once the air clears, once the water settles, you begin to see that the correction was not cruelty, it was rescue. This is why the sign reaches so deeply into a person's life. Some assumptions do not need encouragement, they need interruption. Some inner stories do not need polishing, they need to be broken open by contact with what is real. And when that happens, the first feeling is often not relief. It is disorientation. Your mind reaches for the old shoreline. Your instincts want the sentence back. Yet the bird moves on. And by moving, it teaches you something quiet and powerful. Reality is not responsible for protecting the comfort of your previous interpretation. So, if a long held belief in your life has begun to crack, do not rush to seal it closed. Let the fracture breathe. Let the sighting do its work. Let the unfamiliar shape remain in view a little longer than your habits would prefer. Because sometimes the grace of a true correction arrives in a form you were trained to reject. Sometimes what unsettles you is the very thing sent to free you from a smaller world. And once you stop treating the disruption like an enemy, you start seeing that the bird was never only exposing what was false, it was also pointing towards something you had not yet learned how to recognize. And what it points toward is a different posture entirely. The bird does not teach you how to predict every surprise. It teaches you how to stop building shrines to your current model. That is a harder lesson than most people want, because control feels holy when fear is running quietly underneath it. But the water does not honor your certainty. It only reflects what is there. So the deeper wisdom here is not panic, and it is not passivity. It is disciplined humility. Hold what you know, yes, but hold it with open hands. Let your patterns serve you, but do not let them become idols. The old sentence about swans became dangerous the moment it stopped being an observation and became a law of imagination. That is how the invisible system always overreaches. It takes a useful pattern and crowns it absolute. Then, when the dark bird arrives, the whole structure trembles because it was never built to bow. You can live differently than that. You can prepare without pretending you are omniscient. You can build frameworks without surrendering your soul to them. You can let the evidence of the bird remain stronger than the comfort of the rule it broke. That is maturity. It means your inner life has enough space for truth to arrive in forms you did not forecast. It means you are no longer demanding that reality ask permission before it enters your map. And this matters because the creature's lesson is not only about the world outside you, it is about the way you carry yourself through uncertainty. If every unknown thing feels like a threat, you will keep shrinking your vision until only the familiar remains. But if you learn to stand steady when the unforeseen appears, then surprise stops owning you. The event may still shake the water. It just will not own your center. That is the quiet strength this bird invites, not the strength of perfect prediction, but the strength of remaining honest when prediction fails. Not the pride of having every answer, but the grounded clarity to revise when a living contradiction touches your world. And once you begin standing like that, another realization starts forming. The real test was never whether you could avoid the unforeseen, but whether you could be changed by it without losing yourself. And being changed without losing yourself, that is the real discipline this bird quietly demands. Recalibration, not panic or denial. When the water breaks around a form you did not expect, the first temptation is to react from shock, to rush, to force a quick meaning onto it, to grab the old sentence and stitch it back together before the new sight has time to breathe. But the wiser response is slower. Watch, notice, name what failed, and do not confuse the failure of the model with the failure of reality. That is how you stay centered when the unforeseen appears. You let the fact stand where it stands. You let the evidence be heavier than the story that tried to contain it. The bird does not need your approval to be real. And that is strangely freeing. It means truth exists before your understanding catches up. It means your task is not to control the sighting, but to remain honest in its presence. That is a different kind of strength, the kind that can absorb correction without turning correction into shame. You need that strength because the black swan never only tests ideas, it tests identity. If your sense of self is welded to never being surprised, then every new fact will feel like humiliation. But if your center is built on truth itself, then surprise becomes instruction. The water may still jolt, the breath may still catch, yet something steadier remains. You can pause. You can update the frame. You can protect what is real without protecting what was merely familiar. That is what mature clarity looks like. It does not crumble when a contradiction arrives. It listens. It sorts. It releases what no longer holds. And in that release, something beautiful happens. The same event that could have thrown you into fear becomes a doorway into sharper sight. The same bird that once represented impossibility becomes a teacher of precision, humility, and inner steadiness. So when the next dark form crosses the surface of what you thought you knew, do not reach first for panic or pride. Reach for presence. Stay with the sight long enough to let it tell you what your old map could not. Because when a person learns to meet the bird that way, it stops being only a threat to certainty and starts becoming an invitation to a larger life. And that larger life does not begin when uncertainty disappears. It begins when your relationship to uncertainty changes. The bird has been teaching that from the beginning, not with speeches or instructions, just by existing where old certainty said it could not. For centuries, one part of the world treated that dark form as impossible, and all it took was one true sighting to show how thin that confidence really was. That should humble you, but it should also strengthen you. Because the lesson is bigger than one lake, one voyage, one overturned sentence. Human beings love accumulation. More examples, more records, more proof, more patterns. And patterns matter. They help you move. They help you build. But the bird keeps warning you that accumulation is not the same as completeness. 1,000 familiar sightings can still leave you blind to the one thing that changes everything. That is why wisdom is not just data. Wisdom is reverence for what your current frame has not yet met. You can feel how necessary that is now. If you move through life assuming the visible inventory is the full inventory, you will keep mistaking the known for the whole. You will keep calling the edge of your map the edge of reality. The old belief about swans did exactly that. It mistook repeated experience for final truth. Then one living contradiction arrived, and the world became larger in a single stroke. Not because the world changed that day, because the frame did. That is what makes this creature so quietly immense. It does not only challenge ignorance, it challenges overconfidence. It asks whether you can hold knowledge and humility in the same hand, whether you can build models without kneeling to them, whether you can let one honest sight revise a whole inherited structure without treating revision as defeat. That is maturity at the level of perception. And once you begin to live like that, the old fear starts losing its authority. The unforeseen no longer feels like an insult to your intelligence. It starts feeling like an invitation to deepen it. Which brings us to the question standing just ahead now. When the next impossible thing enters the frame, will you meet it as a prisoner of expectation or as someone already trained by the bird to see further? And if you have stayed with this bird all the way to this point, then you already know this is not only about natural history or language or some old belief that cracked centuries ago. It is about recognition. It is about that moment when something dismissed by the world stands there in full reality, and the world has to decide whether it loves truth enough to change. Some of you have felt that pressure your whole lives without having words for it. You know the feeling. A room settles around one version of what is possible, one approved color, one accepted path, and anything outside that frame is treated like noise. Then something appears, a form, a calling, a conviction, a way of seeing, and suddenly the old map cannot explain the water anymore. That is why this creature reaches you so deeply. It carries an old memory that many souls understand at once. They called you impossible before they had the language to call you real. That does not mean you were meant to become proud of being different. The bird does not strut. It does not demand applause. It simply remains what it is. And by remaining, it exposes the poverty of the sentence that tried to erase it. There is tremendous dignity in that. The power is not in rebellion for its own sake. The power is in alignment. In being true enough that a shallow frame cannot hold you without first breaking itself. This is why the old phrase still matters. Not because impossibility was true, but because it revealed how narrow the imagination had become. So if this message feels uncomfortably personal, that may be because you have been living near one of these thresholds yourself. Perhaps there is a truth in you that has already begun pressing against the borrowed model. Perhaps a dark shape has already crossed the surface of your safe assumptions, and you have been standing there, half awake, deciding whether to honor it or reduce it. Stay with that feeling. Do not rush to explain it away. If this is meeting you right on time, stay close, subscribe, and share it with someone who has been sensing the same thing but could never quite name it. Because the final thing this bird reveals is not just what the old world got wrong. It is what becomes possible the moment you stop asking permission from the wrong map. And this is where the whole investigation finally comes to rest, in a change of sight. For centuries, Europe used the black swan as a name for what could not be. Then, Willem de Vlamingh saw it in Western Australia, and with one living presence, an old certainty gave way. That is the final turn. What people once used to seal the borders of imagination became the very sign that the borders were false. You can feel the holiness of that reversal if you let yourself stay with it. The bird did not conquer by force. It did not win by volume. It arrived, dark against the water, and the universal claim failed on contact. All swans are white, until one is not. That is the whole fracture line. One fact against the system, and the system has to decide whether it serves truth or only its own continuity. That is true of history. It is true of language. It is true of the inner life. So the real revelation is not that the world contains surprises. It is that reality was always larger than the sentence built to contain it. The old phrase, impossible, was never a property of the creature. It was only a measurement of the observer's limits. And once that becomes clear, everything softens into a more honest shape. You stop kneeling to repetition. You stop mistaking familiarity for law. You learn to leave room at the edge of your knowledge for what has not yet come into view. What once symbolized impossibility became, after one sighting, the unforeseen that rewrites every assumption. Not because the world changed its nature overnight, but because a dark body moving through pale water showed how fragile false certainty had always been. By morning, the lake is still a lake. The reeds still lean in the wind. But now there is one black feather caught in the grass at the shoreline, and no old sentence can turn it white again. If this stayed with you, subscribe and keep close for the next one. And if a line or image from this story met you at the right moment, leave it in the comments.